Very good, thank you, Brandy.
Good. Dr. Sears, I'm talking to you today because it's Heart Month, and as an inflammation expert, this is something that's kind of near and dear to you professionally. So I want to know, what is kind of the status of heart health in the U.S. right now?
Well, it's really under flux right now, in that for many years we were told that if you simply lower cholesterol, that you would basically not die from a heart attack. And it turns out that that's true of statin drugs if you already have established heart disease. But the data is now becoming more, let's say at best, problematical if you don't have heart disease, that will statins reduce the likelihood of dying. And we're coming now full circle. But back in the 70s, when I first started doing work on heart disease, there were two competing schools of thought. There was one thought that said that cholesterol was the cause of heart disease, and the other school of thought said inflammation was the cause of heart disease. And those two schools were battling it out left and right. Unfortunately, there was no test of measuring inflammation, but there were soon developed in the mid-70s a simple test for measuring cholesterol. So the cholesterol boys won, and we developed almost in many ways a mythology that cholesterol was the evil villain. But in reality, we know the number one drug to prevent a heart attack and death from a heart attack remains an aspirin that has no effect on cholesterol, but has a great effect on reducing inflammation. And so now we're basically seeing us shifting back in the area of heart health to saying our number one concern, if we want to live longer, is simply decreasing inflammation in the heart. And the question might come, what causes that in the first place? Is it a virus? Is it some type of fungi? Well, it turns out it's our diet. And our diet has become more inflammatory, and as a consequence, even though the amount of mortality from a heart disease has been decreasing, the amount of incidence of heart disease really hasn't changed in the last 20 or 30 years.
So what does that mean, our diet is more inflammatory?
Well, there's two things that basically, at the molecular level, that basically work together to cause an increase of a certain fatty acid. The scientific name is arachidonic acid. I simply call it toxic fat, because in high concentrations it kills. Now, the two items which have changed radically in our diet in the last 30 years has been an increase in refined carbohydrates that increase the levels of insulin, and that by itself is not sufficient. However, the other factor is, and that's been a dramatic increase in the consumption of omega-6 fatty acids, things like soybean oil, safflower oil, corn oil. These things are very rich in omega-6 fatty acids, and when they mix with high levels of insulin, you now start forming more and more toxic fat in the body, and therefore increase the likelihood of having inflammation systemically, not only in your heart cells, but in your fat cells. That's why we're having an obesity epidemic. Into the muscle cells and why we have insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, or into the beta cells of the pancreas is why we have diabetes, or into the brain, why we're seeing an increase in neurological conditions. So this is a persuasive change, and now, unlike the case 30 years ago, we can actually begin to measure inflammation. And so what we want to do is really be focusing on that and looking how we can use the diet to really reduce that inflammation in every organ in the body.
Great. Well, I know there's a lot of talk, the new dietary guidelines came out recently, and there's talk that we should have an increased amount of omega-3 fatty acids in our diet. So what's the difference between those and the omega-6 for people who may not know?
Well, omega-6 fatty acids are the ones that are the building blocks for inflammation. The omega-3 fatty acids have just the opposite effect. They basically put out the fire. So the more omega-3 fats you have, the less inflammatory fire you have in every organ in the body. Unfortunately, our consumption of omega-3 fatty acids continues to drop year after year, and our consumption of omega-6 fats continue to increase. And as we get that imbalance, we're forming more and more inflammation and taking out the control rod, omega-3 fatty acids, that's always been our trump card of keeping this inflammation under control.
Okay. So can you explain to people exactly what inflammation is?
Well, here's the easy explanation. It's bad.
Yes.
And that's about the knowledge of most doctors. They say, I don't know what it is, it's just bad. Well, it turns out that we have to have some inflammation in our body. Otherwise, we'd be a sitting duck for hostile microbes, and they would basically attack us day in and day out, or our injuries would never heal. So we have to have some type of inflammatory response. But if we're now turning on that inflammatory response 24/7 by the diet, now the body is attacking ourselves. And so we have to maintain a zone of inflammation. We need some to basically keep us at, allow us to basically survive in a very hostile world, but too much begins to basically turn our body against ourselves. So again, your goal is to basically just to generate enough inflammation, but basically have enough safety checks, and that's where the omega-3 fatty acids and your diet come into place to make sure that you can recall the rogue warriors once they're sent out from the barracks.
Got it. And what effect does this inflammation have directly on the heart?
Well, there's two types of inflammation. There's the first type I call screaming pain. And that's why you go to the doctor.
That's not pleasant.
No, not at all. And that's why you see the doctor. Otherwise, you never see him. The second type is far more insidious. I call this silent pain, but it's really the best scientific way to describe it as inflammation at the cellular level. This type of inflammation has it's below the perception of pain. And as a consequence, you do nothing to stop it. This is the type of inflammation that basically keeps on growing in the heart until eventually we have an explosion. And one of the big problems in heart disease is what they call soft, vulnerable plaques. These are the plaques that are almost impossible to see by radiation or angiograms, but they're like little pimples. And when they get inflamed, they explode, and then you die. So this is why you want to keep inflammation under control so those little pimples don't explode on you.
Right. So you're talking a lot about how the role diet plays in controlling this inflammation. Is that the best way, or are there other ways to manage or even treat inflammation?
Well, there are other ways, but they have some side effects. They're called anti-inflammatory drugs. Some of the side effects include, osteoporosis, heart failure, and their biggest problem is called death. In that more people die each year in America from taking the correct dosage of anti-inflammatory drugs than die from AIDS. So it's not a very, very good long-term solution. It's a good short-term solution, but not a long-term. So that's why we fall back on to thinking about anti-inflammatory diets. The diets that will keep inflammation under control for a lifetime, and they have no known side effects.
Great. Which is a more natural approach anyway.
Well, and that's why these new breakthroughs in molecular biology are now teaching us how important nutrients are to change our gene expression. So diet is now moving from saying everybody's an expert, eat whatever you want to eat, go ahead, to basically understanding diet as a form of gene therapy. Now, in my particular case, I have terrible genes that predispose me to early death from a heart attack. My father died in his early 50s, and he was in the Basketball Hall of Fame. All his brothers died in their early 50s, as did my grandfather. So genetically, I was predisposed to die from an early heart attack maybe a decade ago. Now, I couldn't change those genes, but I could change their expression. And that's led me to develop the Zone diet as an anti-inflammatory diet to manage that inflammation, to keep it under control, and to live a really longer and better life than my genetics would otherwise predispose me.
That's great. So it's Heart Month, and everyone's promoting a lot of information about Heart Month or about heart health, and we're learning that heart disease is the single largest killer of men and women. Both. For women, that's greater than breast cancer. What's the single most important thing somebody could do to change their heart health and improve their heart health?
Well, we have to realize that people are incredibly lazy. So we have to say, what's the easiest change? Not the best, but what's the easiest change? The easiest change is to take more omega-3 fatty acids. That you can do in 15 seconds a day. Now, the best way is to change your diet. Unfortunately, as Margaret Mead pointed out many years ago, it's easier to change your religion than to change your diet. So we have little chunks. Say, if you're willing to spend only 15 seconds a day to reduce the likelihood of dying from heart disease, you guzzle down as much fish oil as you can in 15 seconds and you call it a day. If you're going to be a little more adventuresome, do the following. Just make sure that when you eat, you use your hand and your eye. And here's all the rules you have to follow an anti-inflammatory diet. Divide your plate into 3 equal sections. On 1/3 the plate, you put some low-fat protein, no bigger or no thicker than the palm of your hand. Now notice my palm is probably bigger than yours. I get to have more protein. It's not fair, but I get to have more protein. Now we look at the other 2/3 of the plate. Now we fill it with colorful carbohydrates. What are those? They're called fruits and vegetables. Now, surprisingly and beneficially, the new guidelines issued last week from the USDA recommends that half your plate should be fruits and vegetables. Well, they're almost there. A little more fruits and vegetables, and basically kind of ease back on the grains and starches, and never add any vegetable oils to your plate. They say, well, what am I going to do for fat? Do the old-fashioned way. Add oils which are heart healthy. Things like olive oil, slivered almonds, guacamole. They're all low in omega-6 fatty acids, and when now you add that to a balanced plate, you have an anti-inflammatory diet.
Well, and it tastes good. I think that people get caught up in like, oh, that cheeseburger's so delicious, but if a grilled chicken with fresh guacamole on it and a salad, it tastes so much. You can actually taste the food, and it tastes so much better. And these healthy foods, they're good for you. They taste great. It's just a better eating experience.
And again, it basically is now validated. This is what your grandmother said. But it's now validated with new breakthroughs in molecular biology, saying that type of eating style allows you to retake control of your genes. And that's a pretty powerful statement, that the food you eat can allow you to change your genetic feature. It can be a very bleak one or a very great one, and you control it 100% by what you stick in your mouth.
Absolutely.
As long as you got one hand and one eye, you can probably do it.
Well, Dr. Barry Sears, thank you so much for joining us today. Some really fantastic information for people about heart health, controlling inflammation. Dr. Barry Sears, creator of the Zone Diet, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brandy.
For dietsinreview.com, this is Brandy Koski. Perfect, thank you.